to acknowledge Chief Clayton from the Clayton for hosting us on the territory today. Thank you very much. And also Lynn Hall. I don't know if Lynn must be here somewhere, but thank you, Lynn, for hosting us as the City of PG. Ravi Kalan is the Parliamentary Secretary that works with me, and Ravi's here in the audience. If you want to wave, Ravi, that's great. Thanks. And to the interim leader of the Green Party, Adam Olson, is here joining us as well. Thank you, Adam. And to the opposition MLAs in the crowd, I know there's many of you out here with great interest in this topic as well, so nice to see you out. I was asked in 3 to 4 minutes. I thought it was 5 to 7, so forgive me if I go over time, but I'm not going to go over time. I was asked to talk to 4 topic areas, but I'm going to cut it down to 2 because I know we have an active Q&A through the, what's it called? The Pigeonhole coming up next. And so the areas I was asked to just touch on was the state of the sector and community worker supports, policy sector, when it comes to sector competitiveness and resiliency, the spruce beetle, and wildfire preparedness. So I'm going to leave the spruce beetle and the wildfire preparedness to if there's any questions about that under Pigeonhole. But as far as the state of the sector, we know very well, all of you here in this room, the challenges that forestry has faced this past year with the U.S. housing market, depressed lumber prices, although they've stabilized a bit now on a good level. The continuing unjust and unfair softwood lumber duties, the tightening of the fiber supply, especially in the interior with the end of the pine beetle wood, and other impacts due to climate change like the forest fire situation we've had. Many of you in the industry who have a lot more experience at this than I do talk about this being cyclical. Whether it's cyclical in a yearly basis on lumber prices, for instance, or cyclical over a 10-year period around how the forest sector is able to make a go of it. So that is true, and that's a little comfort to people who've lost their job because of this recent downturn. And we also know that the cyclical nature, although it applies to a number of the factors I mentioned, we did know and forecast, it was forecast years ago about the downturn in the beetle kill wood and how that would impact overcapacity of the milling structures in the interior. So we're determined to fix the challenges that we can address within BC and also our reputation outside of BC. As far as worker supports, you know that we announced the $69 million interior forestry sector support program. That's well underway. We've also addressed some of the issues on the coast forest sector with forestry contractors who are at risk of losing their equipment due to the extended labor dispute, and we announced a support program for bridge financing for those contractors. What I really want to talk about is the policies around competitiveness and resiliency, and I think one area in the remaining minute or two I have is what Bruce Anderson last night, were most of you able to attend the dinner last night with Bruce Anderson's presentation? Yes? No? Okay. For those of you who were able to attend, he had some really interesting trends, but one of them was people wanting, government to focus on fixing short-term challenges, but not focusing predominantly on those, but talked about the moonshot. In other words, what's the vision? And I think that's what we need to articulate as a government, with industry, with communities in BC around the vision for forestry. And I think the key to that is how the use of forest products really addresses what is a trend. And as Bruce said, embrace the trends, make the trends your friends around wanting to see action on climate change and carbon capture. And that's why we're promoting the use of value-added timber products in tall buildings. It's a moral imperative. It's been described by leaders in the tall building sector, and using the materials, the raw materials in BC to create products that will add value to the value chain and also address carbon capture, carbon sequestration, and substitution of wood for less sustainable products. So that's the moonshot. That's the future of the industry, and that's what we're determined to undertake as a government in concert with industry and communities. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Fraser.
Thank you, Bryan, and great to be here. I don't think I can challenge Bruce on his number of years of coming to this event, but I've been coming to a lot of these too, and it's inspiring to see so many people taking such an active interest and leadership role in the economy of this great province. I want to acknowledge the Clay today and the great territory that we're in today, and Chief Clayton, I enjoyed our little discussion earlier over breakfast. I want to acknowledge the elders and chiefs in the room also, and matriarchs here also, and all of you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Declaration Act, the Declaration Act on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I know that the new legislation has been a topic of discussion in this forum. Certainly, it and our work ahead is top of the mind for all of us in government. At its core, the legislation is about laying the foundation for the future, for a stronger and more inclusive British Columbia, one that creates better opportunities for everybody in the province. So the Declaration Act itself, we brought this in November, right at the end of the fall session. It was unanimous, the vote. All members of the legislature voted in favor of the act. It mandates the government to bring provincial laws into harmony with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And just at its most basic, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is about recognizing in law the rights of Indigenous people, the human rights of Indigenous people. And it's something that the courts have told us over and over and over again, us as in governments, every government, that we need to get on with the business of reconciliation. The courts are a very blunt instrument that no one knows where they're going to go. The courts, governments historically relying on the courts to settle things creates uncertainty, unpredictability, and the courts themselves have advised us very strongly as governments to get on with the business of reconciliation and recognition that rights and title do exist, legally, under law, exist in this province. So I know the industry has questions about what this will mean to the sectors. I know that many of you have been working with us on this. Many of you in this room are ahead of the curve when it comes to reconciliation, ahead of government. The idea, first and foremost, it will foster collaboration and collaborative approaches which create better investment certainty and benefits to local communities. And it will help improve certainty on the land base and ensure that the benefits of sustainability and sustainable development are realized by everyone in the province. I know Minister Donaldson's touched on forestry here in the north, and it's such an important part of the economy and the local economy. And I know it's going through transition. Now more than ever is a time to come together to find solutions and to make sure we still have a very strong and resilient economy when it comes to forestry. And again, I told you, many of you are ahead of the curve on this. Well, it is true. If you're a proponent for a project, working closely with the nations and the territory you're working in, building partnerships, that's what you're already doing. Successful opportunities are created by that. You get a better project when you work with people that have been on the land for thousands of years. You get a better project. And you get more certainty and predictability, and the partnerships that we create by implementing the UN Declaration will lead us to that. It is a pathway forward. It does not make the UN Declaration and the articles within it law. What it does do is it provides a framework for government to start harmonizing our legislation, our practices into the values that are captured within the UN Declaration. That'll happen over time. It's been described as generational. It'll be involving all of you Of course, we need to bring, British Columbia needs to be part of this. We began the process of bringing in the legislation with many months of consulting with many of you in this room. We started out in Calgary, meeting with all the petroleum industry representatives at CAP, and we proceeded from there to make sure that we had understanding, and we got more than understanding, Bryan. We got support that the status quo wasn't acceptable. The uncertainty and unpredictability of the status quo was not acceptable. And it harkens back to one of my first meetings I had in Williams Lake as the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. And I was told that my job was to do constructive damage to the status quo. So I'm hoping that we're all doing a piece of that and making this place a better province, a fairer province, a more predictable province for investment. And we'll all do that together. Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you. Mr. Heyman.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Tene. It is amazing to see so many people in this room. I'm told this is the largest of these gatherings ever, and it's particularly gratifying to see so many business people, so many elected leaders from throughout the North, and so many Indigenous political and business leaders and community leaders here together. So picking up on Minister Fraser's remarks, a little over a year ago, we brought into law a revitalized environmental assessment process, the principles of which were to start consultation with Indigenous people and collaboration with Indigenous people and communities from the very beginning of the process, so that we could define at the beginning what the parameters of a good, acceptable, environmentally responsible and socially responsible project looked like, so people knew what the pathway to an approval looked like. It was also our goal to make that pathway to a good project approval expeditious and clear and respectful and engaging of Indigenous communities, and to promote partnerships with Indigenous communities. On December 16th, that act came into effect, and the first couple of projects are entering the system. So from my perspective, it's critically important that that act delivers what we promised. Collaboration, benefits, expeditious approvals, and good economic development, because I believe that a strong economy supports a healthy environment and vice versa. Minister Donaldson mentioned last night's presentation by Bruce Anderson, and I was fascinated by it. And there were so many factors in terms of the opinions of people representing chambers of commerce and businesses around the province. But two things stuck out for me that I want to address. And one of them was concern people had about the impacts of regulation and the impacts of climate. And I don't take from that people think there shouldn't be any regulation or we shouldn't pay attention to the climate challenge. I doubt that there's anyone in this room who doesn't take it as seriously as most Canadians do. But from my perspective, a good regulation is necessary, it's effective, and it's expeditious in terms of how people can move through the system with minimum cost and the haste that's necessary to move ahead with the project. And from our government's perspective, we have begun and will undertake a review of our regulatory process to ensure that it doesn't stand in the way of developing good projects and that it doesn't drive investment out of BC to other jurisdictions. That's critically important for the benefit of communities in the North, the economy throughout BC, and our efforts to take the measures necessary to do our part for climate change. So lastly, I'll just address climate change. We have been working with the Business Council, with Indigenous people and others for over a year to find ways to market BC's low-carbon commodities that have resulted from 11 years of people responding to a price on carbon. We're leading the world in many areas, and it creates tremendous development and export opportunities for us. It's also critically important that we continue to work with industry to promote the kind of technologies that will further reduce our carbon emissions in British Columbia and give us the competitive advantage for our resources and commodities that we all want to see, while we do the part that our children want us to play in leaving them a world they can inhabit. Thank you.
And last but not least, Minister Ralston, who's been in his role for a week, I think, now. So he's got all the answers, I'm sure, but knows the file very well. So, Minister.
Thanks very much. I'm ascending the learning curve as rapidly as I can, but I want to acknowledge first we're on the traditional territory of the Tene. I really like coming to this conference. As Bryan mentioned, I've been coming here, I think, since 2005, and it's a great conference. It's big enough to have a variety of presentations and opinions, yet small enough to be intimate, and you can, if you just stand in the corridor, you can meet pretty well everyone that you need to meet just by being there, in contrast to the way that we sometimes set up meetings over in Victoria, where it takes considerably longer to actually get to talk to someone. So I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot from coming to this conference, and it's great to see that the conference is thriving and growing. And it is really an important feature of the resources landscape every year, this particular gathering. I've taken on responsibility for the ministry, and let me just talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done and that I plan to continue. In the mining sector, the previous minister, Minister Mungal, appointed a mining task force chaired by Peter Robb, the ADM in the ministry. Came forward with 25 recommendations. All those recommendations have been accepted. 17 have been implemented so far, and the others are being worked on. The ministry allocated an additional $20 million to deal with some of the permitting backlog, and I don't think that is entirely the solution, but that's a strong start in dealing with some of those issues. The innovation roadmap has been funded, and from my previous experience in technology, innovation does really offer many of the solutions that we're looking for in order for companies to be competitive globally. And I think of Lamazoo or MindSense, who are British Columbia companies that have strong technology that will help the mining sector advance. On LNG, of course, we're all experiencing the impact of the final investment decision. Very proud to be part of the Horgan government who made that happen, developed a competitive framework for LNG Canada to take a final investment decision. I think BC Central Credit Union estimates that that project and Site C will lift the entire GDP of the province by 0.5 to 0.75% all on their own. So that's a strong start on the benefits of LNG. And the Premier specifically asked me to make sure I advocate for the sector. I'm also responsible for BC Hydro, which has it's in the second phase of a review of the overall operations and mandate of BC Hydro, and we'll be moving forward with that. And finally, just let me say that I support my colleagues in the implementation of Clean BC. As we heard last night from Bruce Anderson and Abacus, there is a strong support for using a BC brand that speaks to the global desire for low-carbon natural resource products. And I think probably of Rio Tinto Alcan, who's got a partnership with Apple Computers because they want to have a low-carbon, no-carbon product for their manufactured goods. And it's those kind of partnerships that will push British Columbia resources into global prominence and ultimately, I'm convinced, global leadership. And finally, just let me say, my background in the previous file, which I really enjoyed, but technology, as I've mentioned, there are solutions there that I will be paying attention to. And the trade component, we don't, as a small 5 million person jurisdiction in in a global market, international trade, those trade relationships and global markets are really important. And I learned something about that in the previous file, which I will bring to this file. So I look forward to working with all of you and as we move forward together.
Great. Thank you very much, ministers, for all of your comments. And obviously, you're all very, very busy with all of the files you're working on. And it's great to hear how integrated the work is on that. So let's get to the pigeonhole questions. We only have probably a few minutes, so we can get to a couple. So go to the one with the most votes here. And it says, there are numerous initiatives attacking all of our resource industries. What is being done to address this? So I throw it out to all four of you, perhaps, to talk about that. And obviously, it's a collective discussion, but interested. Just jump right in.
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, I'm sure we all have something to say on this one, Brian. And I'll try to be very quick so my colleagues can have some time as well. But I think three things from the perspective of the ministry that I'm in charge of. And one is ensuring that the public trust is there in that we are managing the public resource for first and foremost the benefit of communities and workers. That trust has been eroded, and so we've taken measures legislatively to be more transparent in activities that are going to be undertaken on the forestry working land base. And so by increasing public trust, that addresses a number of the criticisms that people have. Secondly, the work that we're doing together with industry, with First Nations, to ensure that more tenure is in First Nations hands. First Nations are more decision makers around forestry activities on the land base, goes a long ways to address some of those criticisms. And then thirdly, again, as Bruce Anderson said, make the trend your friend. The trend around, and it makes it kind of trite to call it a trend, but the increased concern around climate change amongst especially the young demographic that are going to be taking over from us in the future, and promoting wood and sustainable forestry practices as a way of addressing that trend.
I'll just quickly mention a couple of things. I tried to, it's a bit difficult without knowing what specific initiatives were on the questioner's mind, but I'll go back to the point I made in my opening remarks about working with industry and across government to ensure that necessary regulations aren't an obstacle, that we can create an effective and efficient regulatory regime. Since we were in opposition with respect to a climate program and the carbon tax, we have always talked about addressing the challenges of emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries. We've been working very hard across all industries to find ways to reward as well as assist emission reductions so that we can rebate significant percentages of the above $30 carbon tax, as well as invest in emission reductions and productivity enhancing measures. And we're working, as I said, to help market BC low carbon resources.
Just if I might add, just talking about the BC Mining Association had a campaign to talk about the degree to which mining companies and mining the supply chain is present in BC communities. I did a video at their request on Surrey as a mining town, and that's perhaps a little counterintuitive, but there are, I think it's about 80 or 90 companies in operation in Surrey that are supplying and earn their living by making supplies for the mining sector. So the mining sector pervades the economy as a whole, whether it's in more traditionally considered urban British Columbia or rural British Columbia. So I think it's by talking in a low-key, factual way about the benefits that natural resource industries and sectors bring to our economy and bring to global solutions to climate change that we will convince and bring people with us. I think there's a sense that, in my mind, the tide is turning on some of those issues, although I may be being overly optimistic on a good day. But.
And I know there's conflict, and there will be conflict on projects in this province, and you know, the bill, the Declaration Act, it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve everything overnight. What it does do is it provides a framework for government to move forward cooperatively and you know, in good faith with First Nations in the territories that are affected by projects, and it doesn't take away the government's responsibility to make decisions. That will still occur. What it will do is bring us all together in a way, both industry, government, and First Nations in their territories, in a way that will reduce conflict. Again, there's no silver bullet here. We need to work together. As far as and Minister Ralston, I think, touched on this, but we all have a role to play in explaining and defending the need for resource development in this province, and it is a part of our green future to ensure that we have the materials we need to and to have the ability to create wind turbines and do all the good things that are going to make a better future for everyone. So we have to explain that balance needs to be found, and that's all of our job.
So respecting democracy here, Minister Heyman, there's a question here that has quite a few votes. So
I'm happy
Sure.
I'm happy to answer it, but I'll preface it by saying it's been over 7 years since I was at Sierra Club, and I actually meet with the oil and gas industry more than I meet with Sierra Club. But let me try to answer the question by saying, when I was at Sierra Club, we talked often in pretty much every staff meeting that it was important for us and the public to know what we were saying yes to in terms of responsible economic development, and I continue to urge environmental groups to take that approach. I mean, I think the fact is you're going to be hard-pressed to find an environmental group that is going to stand up and support oil and gas development, but the antidote to that, I think, is for us to have a robust, credible climate plan, and that's what I think we've developed in Clean BC, so we can show we're taking action across the board.
Great. I promise I didn't plant this question, but I think it's an important one. I mean, is BC ready to say yes to more LNG projects? Mr. Ralston, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, certainly there's a climate plan that our future LNG facilities will have to be compatible with. So, but certainly I know that wood fiber LNG is coming forward, although it's a relatively small project, globally speaking, and there will be consideration of other projects as they come forward.
Bryan, you and I were talking over breakfast about the role that technologies can play in reducing emissions in the industry to make them even less carbon intensive. There's tremendous opportunity there. As Minister Ralston said, we have a plan. We've been clear from day one that LNG development has to fit within the plan, and we meet with the industry on an ongoing basis to identify ways in which that can happen.
And unfortunately, our time is coming to a close because this is a very tight session. We need to turn the room around, and are we finishing right now?
We are finishing.
Wow, finishing right this second, I guess. So Sarah's here to pull us off the stage. Thanks very much. Thank you, ministers, for being here, for sharing your time, and thanks to all of you. Looking forward to a great